Her voice was softer than the hum of the city below, yet it sliced through his certainty like glass. That's the wrong document. In that instant, the deal, his empire, and his guarded heart all trembled on the edge of collapse. The penthouse windows stretched from floor to ceiling, but Alaric Davenant barely saw the glittering city beneath them. His focus clung to the stack of contracts in front of him, each page carrying the weight of decades of ambition. Tech prodigy turned billionaire, he had built an empire from code and chaos, only to discover that the higher he climbed, the lonelier the view became. His lawyers buzzed around like bees, checking figures, highlighting clauses, murmuring reassurances. Yet Alaric's jaw remained locked, his hand drumming the edge of the leather armrest. To the outside world, this was triumph. To him, it was another battlefield.
Hello, if you're ready to hear the whole story, click subscribe and tap the notification bell. Type in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as touching as this one, or maybe even crazier. And you don't want to miss it. Now let's begin.
Hello! If you're ready to hear the whole story, click subscribe and tap the notification bell. Type in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as touching as this one, or maybe even crazier, and you don't want to miss it. Now let's begin.
He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times. The flash of signatures, the handshake, the photographs. The $500 million merger wasn't just a deal, it was a performance of control. What no one saw was the raw knot in his chest. Control, for Alaric, was never natural. It was armor hammered out of failure, rejection, and nights spent coding in basements when no one believed in him. And now, as the room pulsed with nervous energy, he realized he hadn't eaten since dawn. His throat was dry, and the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder with every second. Downstairs, in the service wing of the tower, a woman scrubbed a tray with methodical care. Her name was Elowen Morelli, though few in the building ever bothered to ask. They simply called her Maid, as if her presence was an accessory to polished marble floors and imported rugs. But Elowen carried her own world within her, a world marked by fractured trust and quiet endurance. Once, she had studied literature at a provincial university, her voice alive with poetry and dreams. But family debts, her mother's illness, and the collapse of possibilities had drawn her here, into the quiet invisibility of polishing glass and folding linen. She had grown used to being unseen, though part of her still ached for acknowledgement. Not applause, just a glance that said she existed. On that morning, she moved silently through the corridors, carrying a fresh carafe of water for the conference room upstairs. She had walked those halls countless times, invisible in her dark uniform, yet every detail registered: the whispers of suits, the smell of ink, the nervous shuffling of papers. She noticed things others dismissed, because when you are overlooked, your eyes grow sharper. When she entered the private suite where Alaric's meeting awaited, the contrast hit her. The room reeked of tension. Executives stood stiff, lawyers checked their watches, and Alaric himself leaned forward, pen poised above the contract. For a moment, she paused at the doorway, the carafe trembling slightly in her hands. Elowen had seen Alaric before, always from a distance. His name filled headlines, his company's innovations reshaped lives, yet his expression was rarely anything but remote. People said he was cold. To her, he seemed less cold than wounded, a man who mistook detachment for safety. She set the water quietly on the side table. But as her gaze flicked across the documents spread before him, something inside her froze. She didn't mean to read them. Habit made her glance, the way one catches snippets of conversation in passing. But a familiar logo, a single misprinted header, pulled her in. Her brother, before he passed, had once worked at a small legal firm. She'd spent nights helping him proof contracts, cross-checking terms he didn't understand. And in that instant, Elowen realized the stack of papers in front of Alaric wasn't what it was supposed to be. Her pulse kicked in her ears. Should she say something? A maid had no place interfering in million-dollar negotiations. If she spoke, she could lose her job. If she stayed silent, she would watch him sign his empire away. The room buzzed around her, yet for Elowen, the moment stretched. She moved closer, her voice barely above breath. That's the wrong document. At first, no one heard. The lawyers were still muttering over figures. Alaric's pen touched the page. She swallowed hard and leaned near, her words a whisper meant only for him. Sir, that's not the agreement you think it is. Alaric stilled. His pen hovered, the faintest tremor in his grip. For a man who rarely acknowledged staff, his head turned sharply, eyes meeting hers for the first time. Dark, tired, yet piercing. The room seemed to hush, though no one else understood why. Something about the certainty in her tone, quiet, unpolished, yet unwavering, struck deeper than any of his advisor's reassurances. For Alaric Davenant, this was supposed to be the day of ultimate control. Yet with one whisper from someone who shouldn't matter, the ground beneath him began to shift. If you were in Alaric's place, would you trust a stranger's whisper over a room full of lawyers? Or stay silent and risk everything? Comment below. I want to hear your take.
The pen hovered inches from the page, its golden nib glinting under the recessed lights. Alaric's fingers tightened, then froze completely. His lawyers leaned closer, urging him with rehearsed smiles. "Everything's in order, Mr. Davenant, just a signature." But the whisper echoed in his mind like thunder trapped inside a bell jar. That's the wrong document. He glanced at the maid, at Elowen, who had already stepped back, clutching the empty water carafe against her chest as though it could shield her. Her eyes flickered with regret, the kind of regret born of someone who knows she might have just shattered her own livelihood. Alaric's heartbeat was no longer steady. It came fast, erratic, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff. He didn't know why, but he couldn't shake the certainty in her voice. It was raw, unpracticed, but it rang truer than the polished assurances of the legal team surrounding him. "Stop," he said suddenly. The room stiffened. Lawyers exchanged baffled looks. One of the executives half laughed. "Stop what? We're moments from history." Alaric ignored him. With a sharp snap, he closed the folder in front of him. "This is not the right contract." Silence blanketed the suite. For years, Alaric's word had been final, whether in a boardroom or a courtroom. To hear him contradict his own team with such force sent a ripple of unease across every face present. One lawyer pushed his glasses up nervously. "Mr. Davenant, with respect, these are the files we vetted, months of work." "Months of work can be undone by a single mistake," Alaric cut in, his tone icy. But underneath the steel was something else. Doubt, unease, the flicker of recognition that he'd nearly walked blind into a snare. He turned, slowly, back to Elowen. "You." Her stomach dropped. The way he said it wasn't cruel, but it carried the weight of 100 gazes suddenly upon her. She had never felt smaller or more exposed. "What did you mean by that?" Alaric asked. The lawyers chuckled nervously, one of them trying to wave it off. "Sir, she's staff. She has no—" "Answer me," Alaric insisted, his eyes never leaving hers. Elowen's throat tightened. words pressed against her lips begging for release. But she hesitated. To speak again was to dig her own grave. To stay silent was safer. Yet she thought of her late brother, of how he'd warned her that contracts were cages if no one read them carefully enough. She thought of nights hunched over his kitchen table, red pen in hand, catching errors no one else had noticed. She drew a slow breath. "The header," she whispered. "It's marked for subsidiary filings, not merger documents." Confusion rippled across the room. A junior associate grabbed the folder, flipping frantically through the pages, his face drained of color. "She's right," he muttered. These aren't the final agreements. They're preliminary drafts, meant for internal use only." The words detonated in the silence. $500 million balanced on signatures that should never have existed. Alaric's jaw tightened, his gaze sweeping the lawyers like a blade. "You told me this was final?" The lead attorney stammered. It should have been. We must have." "You must have? Do you realize what could have happened if she hadn't spoken?" All eyes flicked back to Elowen. She wanted to disappear into the carpet, but the intensity of the moment pinned her in place. Her hands trembled against the carafe, water droplets smearing across the glass like fingerprints of guilt. For a beat too long, no one said anything. Then, slowly, Alaric leaned back in his chair. His anger wasn't the wild kind. It was contained, precise, like a knife waiting for the right moment to cut. "Clear the room," he ordered. The lawyers sputtered. "Mr. Davenant, with respect." "Out," he said, sharper now. Chairs scraped, papers rustled. One by one, the legal team and executives filed out, throwing sideways glances at Elowen as though she had smuggled a grenade into the room. When the heavy glass doors shut, silence reigned once more. Now there were only two. Alaric studied her as though she were a puzzle he hadn't coded himself. This woman, invisible in plain sight, had just saved him from the brink. Yet why had she spoken at all? Most would have stayed silent, letting the powerful stumble. "You knew," he said quietly. Elowen shifted under his gaze. "I noticed, that's all. Noticed what my entire legal team missed." His words weren't mocking, they were incredulous. "I swallowed. I used to help my brother. He worked with contracts. I recognized the format." For the first time, something softened in his expression. Just slightly. But it was enough to unsettle him more than the near catastrophe had. Because in her quiet honesty, he saw something rare. No agenda, no performance, just truth. Alaric leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You risked your job for that whisper." Elowen's lips curved in the faintest, most self-effacing of smiles. "Some risks are smaller than others." Her words landed like a quiet challenge. For a man who had wagered billions, this perspective disarmed him completely. He exhaled, long and slow, and for the first time all morning, the knot in his chest loosened. The hush that followed lingered like fog. Alaric leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the table, as though staring at the grain of the wood could undo what had just transpired. His breathing was steady, but his pulse betrayed him. A flicker of tension along his jawline, the restless twitch of his fingers. He was not used to being caught off guard. His entire empire had been built on the premise that he saw what others missed. Yet a maid, a woman meant to be invisible, had shattered that illusion in one whisper. Alaric straightened, gathering the scattered papers into a neat stack. "This stays between us," he said at last, his voice low but clipped. Elowen clutched the carafe tighter. "Of course. You don't speak of this to anyone, not staff, not clients, not even your reflection." His words carried weight, but his tone was not cruel, it was defensive. He sounded less like a tyrant and more like a man cornered. Elowen gave a small nod. "I wouldn't." But her gaze betrayed her unease. What if the lawyers came after her for embarrassing them? What if she became a target in a game she had no right to enter? Alaric noticed the flicker in her eyes. Against his will, guilt brushed against him. He had dismissed countless people in his rise, competitors, partners, even friends, but never someone who had saved him. And yet he couldn't allow vulnerability to creep in. Not now, not when so much remained at stake. "Good," he muttered. He pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. The authority in his posture was restored, every movement crisp. "Return to your duties." The dismissal stung, though Elowen expected nothing less. She lowered her head, turned toward the door, and left without a word. The hallway outside was colder than she remembered. Elowen's footsteps echoed as she walked briskly, as though distance alone could erase what she had done. She had broken the unspoken rule of staff: remain invisible, remain silent. Her chest tightened. Why had she spoken? Why risk the one job that kept her afloat, that paid for her mother's medication, that gave her a roof, if not dignity? The logical choice would have been silence. Yet something in her, stubborn and restless, had refused to let him fall. She pressed her palm against the wall, steadying herself. Perhaps he would forget my face by tomorrow. Perhaps it would fade like a ripple in the city's endless noise. She prayed for invisibility to return, even as she knew the moment had carved itself too deeply into both of them. Meanwhile, Alaric paced the empty suite. Papers in hand, he scanned the documents again, frustration rising. How had his team been so careless? How had he? But beneath the anger lay something sharper, the memory of her whisper. "That's the wrong document." It wasn't just the words, it was the way she had said them, firm, urgent, stripped of any performance. No one spoke to him that way anymore. Not his board, not his so-called friends. Everyone measured their tone, adjusted their words to his power. But she had risked herself without hesitation. Alaric slammed the folder shut and exhaled. He hated the way it made him feel, exposed, indebted, aware of a stranger who should have been invisible. "Focus," he muttered to himself. There was still a deal to finalize, still billions at stake. He would not let one whisper derail him. But when he returned to the boardroom, the lawyers' faces looked different. He could see their discomfort, their embarrassment at being caught by someone beneath their notice. It gnawed at him. He had always despised incompetence, but more than that, he despised arrogance, and now he saw it in the very people meant to protect him. That night, long after the others had gone, Elowen lingered in the service wing. She folded table linens with mechanical precision, her fingers tracing invisible creases again and again. Every sound seemed sharper, the hum of the refrigerator, the shuffle of mop buckets. "Why did I open my mouth?" she whispered to herself. She replayed the scene in her mind, his eyes locking onto hers, the room falling silent, the sudden gravity of his attention. It wasn't gratitude she had seen in him. It was shock, yes, but something deeper, a recognition, as though he had glimpsed a truth he couldn't quite name. Elowen straightened and returned to her work. Tomorrow, she told herself, everything would reset. He was a millionaire, she was a maid, and worlds like theirs never truly touched. But Alaric couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his penthouse bedroom, city lights cutting patterns across the ceiling. He tried to lose himself in numbers, projections, strategies, but his mind drifted back to the whisper, the courage in it. He hated this feeling of dependency, of owing someone something. Yet more than that, he hated the gnawing thought that he had dismissed her too quickly. Still, he convinced himself of one thing. Whatever thread that had formed between them, it needed to be cut. She belonged to the world of silence and service. He belonged to the world of power and risk. Intersections like theirs only bred disaster. Better to bury the moment before it grew into something neither of them could contain.
The following morning dawned gray over the skyline, the kind of light that blurred glass towers into pale silhouettes. Alaric arrived at his office early, his usual armor of sharp tailoring and measured calm firmly in place. On the surface, nothing had changed, yet beneath his cufflinks and control, a whisper still unsettled him. His schedule had been rearranged overnight, meetings canceled, calls pushed back, because the merger team needed an emergency review. The fallout from the mistake gnawed at everyone. $500 million had nearly slipped through their fingers, and now no one trusted the paperwork without triple-checking it. Which was why, at 9 a.m. sharp, Eloise Marie found herself summoned. She entered the suite cautiously, hands folded in front of her, as if she'd been called into a courtroom rather than an office. The head of operations, red-faced from lack of sleep, gestured impatiently. "Mr. Davenant insists you assist with the verification process," he muttered. Eloise blinked. "Assist?" "Yes," the man snapped. "Apparently you have an eye for detail." His tone carried more annoyance than praise. To him, her presence was an insult to the professionals whose pride had already been bruised. Eloise hesitated, glancing toward the long table piled with folders. A maid among executives? It felt absurd. But before she could protest, Alaric appeared in the doorway. "Sit," he said, simply, his voice brooking no argument. Her heart lurched. There was no trace of hesitation in his tone, only command. Yet when their eyes met, she caught a glimmer, brief, almost hidden, of something softer. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. Eloise lowered herself into the seat at the far end of the table. Paper slid toward her. She ran her fingers across the crisp edges, the ink smudges, the misaligned headers. Years of invisibility had sharpened her focus. She noticed the details others ignored. As she scanned, silence settled heavy around the table. Lawyers scribbled notes, assistants whispered into phones, but in the center of it all was Alaric, watching her, though pretending not to. Hours passed. The room became a cage of fatigue and tension. Coffee cups multiplied, ties loosened, tempers frayed. Yet Eloise remained steady, her quiet diligence cutting through the noise. At one point, she marked a clause with her pen and slid it forward. This section references an outdated statute. The lawyer nearest her frowned. "That's not relevant. It voids the guarantee clause," she interrupted softly. The lawyer stopped, reread, paled. Alaric's gaze flicked to her again, sharper this time. Each correction she made confirmed what he had begun to suspect. She wasn't just lucky the first time. She saw. By mid-afternoon, the room had emptied of everyone except the two of them. The legal team had scattered to redraft documents, leaving only piles of rejected drafts behind. Eloise remained, stacking rejected drafts into neat towers. "You should go," Alaric said, breaking the silence at last. He stood by the window, the city sprawling beneath him, his reflection ghosted across the glass. You should go." Eloise kept her eyes on the papers. "You asked me to stay." "That was necessity, not choice." Her hand stilled. She looked up, meeting his reflection rather than his face. Sometimes necessity reveals more than choice. His chest tightened at the words. They lingered in the air, too perceptive, too piercing. Alaric turned slowly, studying her. He had built his empire on algorithms, data, and precision, on the belief that people were variables too unreliable to factor in. Yet here was a woman whose presence unsettled all his equations. "Why?" he asked finally. Eloise tilted her head. "Why what? Why risk yourself yesterday? Why risk yourself today?" Her lips parted, then closed again. For a moment, silence stretched, heavy with everything she could not say. That she knew what it meant to lose everything. That she had seen too many people silenced because no one dared to speak. That she could not stand by while someone walked blind into ruin. Instead, she said quietly, "Because it was right." Alaric's throat worked. Simple words, yet they struck harder than any argument. The air between them shifted, not soft, not tender, yet charged, as though an invisible thread had been tied without their consent. Elowen stood, gathering the last of the papers. "If I've finished my part, I should go." But her steps faltered when Alaric moved closer. Not menacingly, just close enough that the distance they'd both clung to seemed suddenly fragile. He searched her face, as though trying to decode something hidden between her eyes and the curve of her mouth. For a man who thrived on control, this nearness unsettled him more than any failing contract ever could. "You're not invisible anymore," he murmured. The word startled her, as if he had reached into the deepest truth she lived with every day. Elowen lowered her gaze, her voice barely audible. "Maybe that's not safe, for either of us." Neither spoke again. The silence was its own confession. That evening, when she returned to the service wing, her co-workers eyed her with curiosity. Why had she been upstairs all day? Why had Mr. Davenant himself asked for her? She deflected their questions with polite smiles, but inside, her world felt unsteady. Because she knew, proximity changes everything, and no matter how hard they both resisted, the line between necessity and something deeper had already begun to blur.
The following week blurred into endless meetings, revisions, and tense negotiations. Yet Elowen kept finding herself in the same rooms as Alaric, her presence no longer confined to quiet corners. What had started as necessity had become habit. He asked for her whenever the documents were reviewed, not openly, not with explanation, but with the certainty of someone who trusted her eyes more than he admitted. Each time she entered, the lawyers stiffened, but no one dared protest again after the last near disaster. Still, Alaric remained guarded. He spoke to her only in clipped requests, never straying into personal words. Yet his gaze lingered longer than before, as though curiosity pressed against the armor he had welded around himself. One evening, long after the office had emptied, Elowen stayed behind to gather scattered drafts. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and outside the city glowed with restless energy. She hummed under her breath, an old tune her mother used to sing while hanging laundry in their tiny backyard. The sound drifted into the silence until Alaric's voice interrupted. "What is that?" Elowen startled, dropping a folder. She hadn't realized he was still in the room. He leaned against the window frame, tie loosened, jacket draped carelessly over a chair. For once, the polish was stripped away. He looked less like an untouchable figure and more like a man worn thin. "It's just a song," she said quickly, crouching to gather the papers. "Where did you learn it?" She hesitated, her hands stilling on the folder. "From my mother. She sang it while she worked. It made the chores lighter." Alaric studied her. Something in her tone, nostalgia mingled with sorrow, caught at him. He crossed the room slowly, picking up one of the fallen pages she'd missed. She must have been remarkable. Her throat tightened. Few people asked about her family anymore. She pressed the folder against her chest. She was, still is, though illness keeps her in bed most days. A silence fell, softer this time. Alaric handed her the page, his hand brushing hers for the briefest second. His voice lowered. "And yet you carry the weight for both of you." The words struck deep. She turned away, busying herself with aligning the folders. "We all carry something." Alaric should have let the moment end. That was his habit, never linger where vulnerability threatened. But Elowen's words unlocked something old, something he had long buried. "My father left when I was 7, he said abruptly. Elowen's head snapped up. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the city through the glass. His voice was even, but stripped of its usual control. "He was brilliant. People said I inherited his mind, but brilliance meant nothing when he gambled away everything we had. One night he was gone, and with him the roof over our heads. My mother worked double shifts to keep food on the table. I told myself I would build something no one could take away from me. And I did."
He finally turned to her, his eyes shadowed with a vulnerability he rarely allowed. But building doesn't erase abandonment, it just hides it under steel and glass. Elowen's breath caught. For the first time she saw not the titan of industry, but the boy who had lost too much too soon. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. Alaric blinked. Regret what? Building the empire, hiding behind it. The question landed like a strike. His jaw clenched, but not in anger, more in recognition that no one else dared ask him such things. He gave a half smile, wry, brittle. Regret is a luxury. Survival doesn't allow for it. Elowen lowered her gaze, her fingers tracing the folder's edge. She understood that too well. For a long moment, the office held its breath. Two people from different worlds, yet bound by the same unspoken truth. Survival had cost them more than anyone else realized. Elowen finally broke the silence. Sometimes survival feels like forgetting who we are. Alaric's eyes softened, the steel in them flickering. And sometimes it takes someone unexpected to remind us. Her heart stumbled at the words. But before either could say more, a knock shattered the fragile stillness. An assistant entered with a stack of revised contracts, cheeks flushed. "Mr. Davenant, the board is waiting." The moment dissolved. Alaric's expression shuddered, his armor sliding back into place. He nodded briskly, taking the papers. Elowen busied herself with collecting the discarded drafts, retreating into invisibility once more. Yet both knew something had shifted irreversibly. That night, Elowen lay awake in her small apartment, the sound of her mother's coughing drifting through the thin walls. She replayed his words: abandonment, steel and glass, someone unexpected. They echoed against her ribs, filling spaces she thought long numbed. And across the city, Alaric sat alone in his penthouse office, staring at the reflection of his own weary face. He pressed a hand against the glass, the city lights fractured beneath his palm. For the first time in years, he wondered not about profits or risk, but about the cost of living behind walls too high for anyone to climb. The storm finally broke on a Thursday evening. Rain sheeted down the glass walls of Alaric's headquarters, streaking the city lights into blurred constellations. Meetings had stretched long past dinner, and most of the building stood empty except for a few scattered staff. Elowen remained upstairs, her uniform damp at the hem from an errand outside. She had been asked to deliver one last set of corrected contracts, and though exhaustion tugged at her, she pushed through. When she entered Alaric's private office, she found him still at his desk, shoulders hunched, hair falling loose against his temple. For a moment, she hesitated in the doorway. The sight was strangely human. No armor, no polished veneer. Just a man alone under the dim lamplight, papers spread around him like unfinished confessions. "You're still here," she said quietly. Alaric looked up, surprise flickering across his features. "So are you." Elowen placed the folder gently on his desk. "The revisions you requested." He barely glanced at them. Instead, his gaze lingered on her rain-damp sleeves, the tired lines around her eyes. "You should go home." "So should you," she countered. The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Touché." Minutes stretched into silence. The rain tapped against the windows, steady as a heartbeat. Elowen moved toward the side table, pouring water into 2 glasses without asking. When she placed one in front of him, his hand brushed hers, unintentionally, yet the spark of contact lingered. He lifted the glass. "You've saved me more times this week than my entire legal team." Elowen lowered her gaze. "I only noticed what they overlooked." "No," Alaric said firmly, "you noticed what I overlooked." The weight in his tone made her chest tighten. He wasn't talking about clauses or contracts anymore. She sat across from him, the desk no longer a barrier but a shared space. For the first time, the conversation wandered. "Did you always know you'd build something like this?" she asked, gesturing at the towering office around them. Alaric leaned back, exhaling softly. "No, I only knew I didn't want to be powerless again. Every line of code, every deal, was a step away from the night my father left. Success became survival." Eloin's eyes softened. "And now?" "And now," he admitted, staring into the rain, "I wonder if survival is all I've done. If somewhere along the way, I forgot how to live." The words hung between them, fragile and raw. Eloin clasped her hands together. "You're not alone in that." He turned to her, something unguarded in his expression. "What about you?" She hesitated. "I thought I'd be a teacher. I loved books, words. But after my father's deaths, after my mother's illness, I traded classrooms for cleaning supplies. Dreams don't pay bills." The deal was scheduled to close in less than 48 hours. The building buzzed with urgency. Assistants racing down hallways, lawyers murmuring in tight clusters, phones pressed to ears like lifelines. Alaric's entire empire balanced on the signature that would finalize the merger. Investors circled like vultures. Competitors sharpened their knives. Yet for all the noise, his thoughts kept circling back to one face. Eloin. Her words still lived in him. "Then don't disappear." They had become an anchor, steadying him in the storm. But anchors could also drag you under. That evening, Alaric entered the conference room to review the final revisions. Eloin stood at the far end, arms full of documents she'd been asked to deliver. Their eyes met briefly, and though neither spoke, the flicker of warmth was undeniable. Until it wasn't. Halfway through the session, a senior lawyer named Bramwell leaned across the table with a thin smile. "Mr. Davenant, we should discuss your unconventional reliance on staff during this process." Alaric stiffened. "What are you implying?" His gaze shifted towards Eloin. "It doesn't inspire confidence that critical documents are constantly in the hands of a maid. Investors might question whether your judgment has been compromised." The room stilled. Eloin froze, the sting of the word "maid" slashing sharper than intended. Alaric's jaw tightened. He should have defended her, should have cut Bramwell down with the force of his authority. Instead, fear prickled through him. Fear of looking weak, of giving enemies leverage. "She's here on my instruction," he said coolly, eyes never leaving the contract. "Let's keep our focus where it belongs." The dismissal was subtle, but the wound it carved into Eloin's chest was anything but. Her throat burned. She lowered the documents to the table, hands trembling, and slipped out quietly. Alaric didn't follow. Later that night, he found her in the lower lobby, waiting by the service elevator with her coat clutched tightly around her. Rain slicked the marble floor from workers tracking in water. She looked like she might vanish into the shadows if he blinked. "Aloan," he called softly. She turned, her expression shuddered. "You should get back upstairs. They're probably waiting for you." "Don't do that," he said, stepping closer. "Do what?" Her voice was sharp, brittle. "Pretend you don't care?" Her laugh was short, humorless. "Care? You let him reduce me to nothing more than a label in front of a room full of people, and you—" her voice cracked, anger fighting with hurt. "You said nothing?" Alaric's chest constricted. "I was protecting the deal. Do you have any idea what's at stake?" She met his eyes, fire burning through her pain. "Do you have any idea what's at stake for me? I've spent years being invisible, holding everything together for my mother, swallowing every insult because survival demanded it. For once, I thought—" Her voice faltered, raw. "I thought you saw me." He reached for her, desperation breaking through. "I do see you." She pulled back. "No, you see the convenience I bring, the corrections, the quiet loyalty, but when it mattered, when it cost you something, you chose The city woke the next morning wrapped in gray skies. Alaric stood before the towering windows of his office, the final contract resting on his desk like a loaded weapon. The merger would be signed within hours. On paper, it meant victory, stability, expansion, dominance. But his chest felt hollow. The echo of Elowen's words haunted him more than the thought of losing 500 million ever could. You chose silence. He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion sinking deep. For years he had believed that success meant never needing anyone, never exposing the fractures of his past. Yet now, at the moment of his greatest triumph, all he could think of was the one person absent from the room. What good was survival if it meant living behind glass, untouchable but unseen? Across the city, Elowen folded laundry in the dim light of her apartment. Her mother's soft breathing filled the silence, punctuated by the occasional cough. Elowen's hands moved automatically, shirt, fold, stack. Yet her mind wandered endlessly back to him. Alaric's face when he almost reached for her, his voice cracking under the weight of denial, the glimpse of a boy still haunted by abandonment. She had walked away because she had to, because survival demanded she protect what was left of her heart. But now, folding shirts worn thin with years of struggle, she couldn't shake the thought that maybe she had abandoned him, too. Her mother stirred awake, her voice hoarse but gentle. "Ellie, you're crying." Elowen quickly wiped her cheek. "It's nothing." But her mother's tired eyes held wisdom. "It's never nothing when someone touches the soul. Don't run from it, child. Life already takes too much. We mustn't take away what little joy it gives." The words pierced her like a key turning in a long locked door. At the headquarters, time pressed forward. The board gathered, investors lined up, the air humming with anticipation. Bramwell leaned toward Alaric with a sharp smile. "All that remains is your signature. Once done, you'll secure your place among the untouchable." Alaric's pen hovered over the line. Untouchable. The very word that had once been his armor now felt like a curse. He looked at the blank space waiting for his name. A hollow victory stared back at him. He set the pen down. "Step outside," he ordered curtly. The room stilled. "Sir," Bramwell asked. "You heard me. All of you. Leave." Confused whispers rippled, but no one dared argue. Within moments, the room emptied, leaving Alaric alone with the silence and the weight of choice pressing against his chest. Meanwhile, Elowen stood at the threshold of her apartment, coat in hand, heart racing. Her mother's words echoed, "Don't run from it." But fear warred with hope. What if she returned only to be dismissed again? What if her presence cost him more than she could repay? She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. Sometimes survival meant retreat, but sometimes survival meant risking everything for the one thing that mattered. Her feet carried her out the door. Back at the headquarters, Alaric pressed his palms against the conference table, breathing heavily. For once, he didn't know the answer. Control had always been his compass. Yet here he was, paralyzed by the possibility of choosing wrong. He remembered Elowen's laughter, brittle yet brave, her resilience, the way she looked at him not as a millionaire, but as a man. He whispered into the empty room, barely audible. "I can't lose you, too." The doors creaked open. Alaric spun around. Elowen stood there, rain still clinging to her hair, chest rising and falling with nerves. She had come. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of pride, fear, and longing thickened the air. Finally, Alaric stepped forward, voice unsteady. "You were right. I failed you. I failed myself. All my life, I thought strength meant silence, that survival meant building walls. But the truth is, I don't want to survive without you in it." Elowen's heart pounded. The walls she had built trembled under the force of his words. But still she asked, voice breaking, "And if they see me as nothing more than a maid? If they think less of you because of me?" Alaric closed the distance, his eyes fierce and vulnerable all at once. "Let them. I'd rather lose their approval than lose you." Her resolution cracked, tears spilling freely. For the first time she saw him not as the man behind glass, but as someone who had finally broken free. She whispered, "Then don't let me disappear." His hand reached for hers, firm and steady. "Never." The silence that followed was no longer hollow. It was full of choice, of courage, of love beginning to take root.
The conference room was empty, except for two figures, Alaric and Elowen, standing on the edge of a decision greater than any contract. The final papers still lay on the table, awaiting signatures that would bind fortunes, reputations, futures. Yet in that moment, the true weight was not in the ink, but in the silence between them. Alaric lifted the pen again, this time steady not with power, but with clarity. His voice carried softly, almost like the whisper that had started it all. "Is this the right document, Elowen?" Her lips parted, breath trembling. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to collapse into the echo of that first warning. The moment she had risked everything to whisper, "That's the wrong document." Now she stepped closer, her hand brushing over his as she scanned the page. "Yes," she said gently. "This time it's the right one." But she wasn't talking about ink on paper. When the board filed back in, murmurs swelled at the sight of Elowen standing beside Alaric. Bramwell's disapproving scowl deepened, but Alaric didn't flinch. Instead, he addressed the room with a rare openness. "I built this company to prove I could never be abandoned again. But no amount of wealth can replace trust. I nearly lost everything, not to a contract, but to silence. That ends today." He signed with a firm stroke, then set the pen down. "This merger is strong, but it's stronger because of the woman who dared to speak when no one else did." Gasps rippled. Elowen's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "Mr. Davenant," Bramwell objected, "with all due respect to—" "No," Alaric cut him off, his voice commanding, "with all due respect to her. Elowen saved this company, and she reminded me what it means to be human. That matters more than your approval." The silence that followed was electric. No one dared challenge him further. Later that night, when the building had quieted, Alaric and Elowen stood together in the private office. The city stretched out before them, endless lights reflected in the glass. Alaric turned to her, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. "You gave me more than survival. You gave me back the chance to feel alive." Elowen's throat tightened, emotion flooding her. "And you gave me more than invisibility. You saw me, even when it cost you. No, especially when it cost me. Because that's when love is real." Her tears shimmered, but her smile was steady. "So what now? Now I stop hiding. And if you'll let me, we build something together. Not out of fear, out of love." She pressed her forehead against his, their hands entwined. For once, neither felt like they were surviving. They were beginning. Weeks later, whispers spread not about the merger, but about the tech magnate who walked into board meetings with the woman once overlooked by everyone else. Some scoffed, some marveled, but Alaric never cared. His empire no longer needed walls. It had a foundation stronger than steel. Elowen continued caring for her mother, but now she did so with a partner who stood beside her, not above her. The world still threw challenges their way,
But the silence that once defined their lives was gone, replaced by a dialogue of trust, laughter, and sometimes quiet tears shared without shame. The rain eventually gave way to clear skies. One evening, they stood on the balcony of Alaric's home, the city stretching infinite and alive beneath them. Eowyn leaned against him, her voice soft. "Funny, isn't it? One whisper changed everything." Alaric tightened his arm around her. "Not just everything. Us." She smiled, the city lights mirrored in her eyes. "Then let's promise no more silence." He kissed her gently, sealing the vow. For once there was no glass, no distance, just two souls seen, heard, and finally free. If you were in Eowyn's place, facing the risk of speaking up against powerful silence, would you have whispered the truth, even at the cost of everything? Share your thoughts below.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you loved this story, you will definitely love the next one. It's more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So go ahead and watch it now. Click on the image on your screen right away to watch the next one. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. It helps and encourages us to share the best human interest stories you'd love.